I'm live at the Red House with a musician I really look up to, Jonathan Greene, and thank you for coming over to talk today.
Thank you for having me.
So we were kind of just, I don't know, dusting off, talking about social media and stuff, and the question was, I guess, to give context to where we're going to jump off. A lot of the conversations on this podcast are about like navigating social media,
Sure.
asking questions about what we're doing as artists and how we're existing in the modern world and stuff. And I made the comment to you a minute ago. I perceive you as somebody who's just like a wealth of knowledge within your craft. And so the idea that you would even be insecure about anything is surprising to me.
I was reading a study. It's funny about like millennials my age sort of being less self-assured than people that came before and actually a little after. Like millennials some of us have a perspective or an image of being really confident, like sort of in that kind of Dunning-Kruger kind of way. Mm-hmm. Some of that's just like youthful energy. But a study was done. I can't remember where it was done, but just about the watching undergrads and graduates and sort of rating their self-assuredness, and it was lower than Gen Xers and the generation that younger millennials. And I thought that was interesting that like I kind of fit in that mold, even though I'm not an undergrad or didn't go to graduate school or anything like that. I'd still kind of, and that could have been the emergence of social media and this comparison game that brought. Now greatness is 30 seconds away, as long as it takes for you to pick up your phone and open the app, which most of us are muscle memory programmed to be able to do that in an instant. At this point, I do it without thinking sometimes. Even if I think about calling somebody or texting someone, like my thumb will move to a social media platform just because it's probably the thing that I do the most. Right? So I don't know. I'm sure there are other markers. I know people that are my age that at least seem confident, but I am increasingly becoming less and less interested in how someone sort of presents with their confidence level and more about the inner workings, because there's this there's a grind game happening on social media. You have people like Gary Vee and others that basically try to just talk about, hey, do it, fake it till you make it, push, like that grind culture. And I think that voice in certain spaces can be louder than the self-care, really understanding who you are and really breaking down the things that make us human so that we can overcome certain toxic habits or certain dysmorphic ways of seeing ourselves. And I feel like things like that are less and less talked about than, hey man, I'm out here grinding, we're out here making it, let's get that money, or look at what everything that I've accomplished. It's like, how in the world were you just born like that? Were you born magic and pushing in with the iron and will to make everything happen, or how did you work through your shit? How did you get through? Because a couple days ago, I even had a moment where I'm sitting at my drum set and I know I have to practice. I have certain goals in my mind. I have things I have to do, but I'm sitting there sort of almost crumbling under the weight of my own expectations, my perceived expectations from others. And I'm sitting at the drum set and I can't move. Why don't we talk about that more? Like, I've only seen anxiety or depression as like ammunition for the tortured artist, and it's all due to like productivity. It's this idea that like you, in order to be artsy and like in order to make this impact, you have to have gone through some darkness and weaponize it in a way to be unique. And we've all done that enough to be able to see the degradation of the person behind the art. That is not a sustainable way to live, and I'm not saying that we all don't go through things, but I want to hear more stories about the reality of that darkness and the inner struggle and what real successful people have done to keep that at bay.
So you just touched on and introduced a pretty good, you introduced somewhere where we could really go in so many directions. I guess the first question maybe is like, is this what you're experiencing with social media? Are you noticing in yourself a desire that you want to express kind of what you were just kind of describing that you'd like to see more of in the world.
Absolutely. But then I get the sense that not being a psychology major or a sociology major, that I am underqualified to make sweeping observations of human nature. You know, it's a weird thing where, and this is where I think the millennial or social media thing kind of comes in. A lot of people, there are a lot of faces and a lot of floating heads saying what you should do or what has helped them, and people use those as gospel, or at least, you know, as reliable. And I'm not sure. I still have the critical brain that kind of took me out of Christianity and religion. And I kind of look at everything that way. So I'm very critical of most things whenever I look at them, even on YouTube, is looking at content creators or whatever. But I always focus that criticism back at myself. And I'm like, well, I mean, just because I'm here, I mean, most of it I just want to share, but I don't have answers to. I can say I was depressed and eventually, or maybe depressed is too strong, I felt paralyzed for an hour, 45 minutes, and kind of sat with that until it passed. And then at some point I was able to get work done. Do I know how to get out of that faster? No. Do I know what you should do in order to get through that? No. I don't even know why, what triggered that paralysis, or how, like, the inner workings of how I got out. It just kind of happened. And so there's this duality of, like, talking about my experiences, but they almost seem like mystical or magical because I can't explain them. And they not explaining things is the thing, is like, okay, I'm telling you my problems, but I'm not really giving you an answer. I'm only saying, if you're like me, then we can have some type of camaraderie, so you're not alone. And is that enough?
Yeah. I remember a few episodes back talking to someone about what felt like to me this sort of what happens with the use of social media, this almost cult of positivity, where a lot of what you're describing is not welcome in this territory. It's a lot about presenting this image of yourself. It feels to me like, and the reason I have such a hard time participating in it sometimes is it feels like this self-aggrandizing, self-complimentary sort of like, congratulations to me. And if I put out the idea, congratulations to me, and how, sort of easy to look at I am, everyone else will see me that way too, or something. And a lot of what you're describing, the dark side of humanity, the dark side of artistry, I do notice that there are glimpses on maybe other platforms than the ones that I care to grow on. Like, and that's also a strange question too, how we decide which ones it matters to have an audience on. But I notice sometimes when I reach a breaking point, I will express something on Facebook that I'm just like, I can't not express this anymore. And for some reason that breaks through with people. But on Instagram, it's too much of an idealistic territory for that to translate over.
Sure.
I don't know if you experience that or not, but
TikTok, I think, is where the broadest of this broad spectrum of content exists, because you have really, really highly curated content, but you also have people just with their phones talking about the bad day that they had. You know, Instagram doesn't have that because it started as a photography social media. Like, it was about pretty. That's what Instagram was about. Facebook is ugly. And I definitely contributed to that when I was in my keyboard warrior days.
yeah.
Luckily, I've grown a little bit out of that, so I don't feel like I have to correct anytime I feel like someone says something wrong on the internet. But it has more to do with how you feel. What is the purpose of social media, and is all of this helping or hurting, and what type of content helps or hurts? So I think that I've stuck to Instagram, and I'm leaning towards TikTok because I tried to fancy myself as a YouTube person because I like long form content, but I'm actually not the best at producing it because it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of planning. And that's not, usually how I like to do things. I mean, it's just that I seem to work in shorter clips, right? And I'm not sure if that's my laziness, my lack of education, because my favorite content to consume are video essayists. I like media criticism, and I like political commentary shows, or anything that's long and goes in depth into things, from the history of like old cinema, to essays on crypto. It doesn't matter what it is. If somebody's obviously done their homework and presented all these facts in a compelling way, I kind of dig it. And I always wanted to be that person, and it doesn't seem like that aligns with my habits, like sort of how I operate in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, I follow you on, I mean, we're friends on Facebook, and I, could see you there. And I do see like your photos and stuff sometimes. But I'm more so notice your stuff stand out on Instagram among the drummers that I follow and stuff. I'm not on TikTok, and I don't think I was aware of your YouTube efforts or whatever. So, I guess whatever you're exploring right now, it sounds like you're turning your attention to TikTok. Like, what are you trying to do there?
I'm trying to condense my points, because I am a very verbose and long-winded person, especially if you put a microphone in my face. But I am trying to make the things that I'm trying to say shorter and maybe not punchier. But I do appreciate high production value. So maybe I'm trying to pivot to something that is a little bit easier to create. And most of the traffic is on TikTok right now. So I am not an early adopter of anything. Usually I sit back and sort of wait for things to develop. And so I was very resistant to TikTok until my wife started sending me TikTok videos. And looking at the spaces that she likes and the type of content that those people make, I was impressed. I was impressed with the insights and the creativity and just the variety of things. It's not all funny. It's not all stupid memes. It's not all trend. It's, some people putting real care and attention to bringing issues that aren't really talked about in many places. Yeah, they don't have hundreds of millions of views, but they have, hundreds of thousands, and so I've been trying to figure out what my goals are on social media. I think that's the thing that I didn't really start out with. What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? The first thing I was trying to accomplish was to fill a space that I didn't feel like larger drum platforms hit, because no one was funny in the drum space or the music space 5 years ago, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Right now, everyone's caught on, and people know how to create. Everybody's sort of hacked the language of YouTube. And so now that other people are out there doing it better than me, some of them are doing it as solo people. Others are, have, people like staff. I feel like I don't really have the same type of drive to create in that way, because there are other people that I see that are doing that and doing a great job.
Yeah, man. I remember it was just recently, I think I heard Tim Dillon talking about TikTok has this sort of like no one takes it that seriously vibe to it. And he said, that's what social media always should have been like. And when I think about the like dramatic emphasis that I put on the importance of when I put like the pressure I feel when I try to engage on Instagram or whatever, that is the result of the feeling, is like I just wish it wasn't so serious, and I wish it was more of a relaxed thing, like you would hope it would be. And it seems like TikTok is that, and I think what you described about like the humor aspect taps into that. And yeah, YouTube has been like such a monumentally informative, like game changer, the ability that all these people have found to just reach an audience on their own through this means, with like low budget, low productions and all this stuff. And just it changed. I don't know. I wonder, what do you think? Do you think it changed the content people wanted, or revealed to them the content they wanted in the first place?
I think that, well, you have a couple of things there. You have the company and what it feels like it can and can't sell. You have the content, the type of content that people want to make, and you have what audiences seem to be either receptive to or primed for, and that all of those things change over time, right? So you may have, I mean, I feel like YouTube back in the day was a little bit more like the Wild West and a lot more weird, short, kind of like E-Bombs World-ish type of like coming from like flash animation and the weirdness of like the early internet was on YouTube. It's still there, but it's more of, now that it's bigger, it's corporate, which means it has financial backing, and you have smaller businesses that depend on YouTube for its talking to audiences, even if they've already been funneled towards whatever their websites are or Patreon or something like that. Their main, let's call it channel, is YouTube. So you have to curate your content based on what the sensibilities of advertisers are, or circumvent the need for advertisers with Patreon. And depending on what you can do at whatever moment, that determines how you're going to craft your content. Because if you don't have the subscriber count in order to not need corporate backing through advertisements, then you have to play nice until you have more freedom. I mean, and even with like the beginning with videos being shorter, and then people started to notice that, oh, well, people actually like longer watch times. Something closer to like a 30-minute television show seems to be like the magic thing. And then you have these video essayists that from 45 minutes to 3 hours, you know, and they still have the watch time. So it's less about like what audience Big A wants, but connecting with your people, no matter what social media platform you're on, finding your audience, your people, and figuring out what the compromise is between like what you want to do and what other people will tolerate.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it seems like instead of trying to create something that is sufficient to 1 million people, the goal seems to be to create something that's like truly meaningful to maybe 50,000 people or something like that. The scales could be totally different, but the point is that these independent creators being on these platforms, it seems to give you that ability to like develop an audience that's like truly invested in what it is that you happen to create.
But the problem isn't any of that. The problem is consistency. That's where I and a lot of my friends fail. It's consistency. It's the audience grows the more you do the thing. You get better the more you do the thing. But we tap out too early, 20 episodes of whatever, and then we're like, I don't see the growth. And that's not how any of this works. Yeah, there have been some edge cases where people are viral really fast, or some bigger creator gives them a bump. But you start talking in like when you hit your 50th episode, your 100th episode, like what's your audience then? Have you been consistent with your creation? Are you taking like these weird unannounced breaks? And that's a lot of audience management. Like as long as they know what to expect from you, then you're fine. But if you're inconsistent, then none of that's going to grow.
Yeah, that's what I've always heard about podcasts in particular. Longevity is the defining trait.
Right.
So I guess I had heard at one point, I think John Ray was telling me that you guys had like dabbled in some stuff of your own. So what are your like marketing branches and like content products or whatever at this point? Do you have anything in particular? Or are you like still in that sort of figuring out what you're going to do?
I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do. Like Dramosophy is my YouTube channel. That's what it's called.
Okay.
And that's kind of my baby and also my bastard child, because I hit the ground running, not knowing how to work a camera, not really sorting out my voice, even though my voice is sort of my voice and it's kind of going to be with me for whatever I do. But one thing that I did wrong is I was reactionary. I looked at every video that taught like one thing in the span of like 15 minutes. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to put out a video and it is going to be a year's worth of work for somebody to get around, right? And I shot myself in the foot, because not only is that not how people work or how people learn, but I don't want to go back and retread any of that, even though I probably need to, because I already did it and it's been out there. And so, number one, I wasn't consistent, because I'm sitting for forever for people on YouTube or drummers to understand that I kind of laid out the code, my code, 4 years ago, and it's just been sitting there with 500 views, even though I've had a healthy amount of people ask me how I do what I do, or, will ask me like all of these questions. And all of those questions, a lot of those questions have already been answered, and it's there, but that's not their fault, right? That's my fault, because I am not pushing that YouTube channel. I'm not consistently creating content. I create content for that whenever I feel like it. There's a cost for that. And so how much can I say I want to be a YouTuber when I personally am not conforming to the things that YouTubers have to do in order to be successful?
Yeah, that is interesting to think about. I notice among a lot of creative people, there's like a bunch of like hesitance to even acknowledge I want to use you. Like, it's like one thing to say I want to use YouTube and try to make money off of it, and then this other realm of being willing to say I just fucking love this platform, and I like what people do with it, and I want to be somebody that does that. And it seems like, regardless of the fact that YouTube is like the third largest search platform in the world, there's still this weird sort of like not illegitimate, I think, feeling that we sometimes give it, or sometimes associate with it. And I think that also could contribute to this whole thing about like, I don't want to play the game. I don't want to play the YouTube game, because it's like, that's YouTube land. That's YouTube territory.
YouTube/Instagram/TikTok or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, right? There's this idea from elder millennials and older that, and even Dave Chappelle said it, like, Twitter isn't real. And I'm like, okay, look, if you have you have terrorists using the platform to like try to coordinate like their operations, what part of that is not real?
Yeah.
Like, on one hand, I understand what you're trying to say, but you can't at one point talk about the virtues of free speech and disregard its impact. If you're talking about the biggest speech platforms, well, we guard it because we guard free speech because we know how powerful it is, right? But that conversation always seems like people want to talk out of both sides of their mouth.
Yeah.
And so pivoting back to music, if you want to talk about how these speech platforms are allowing people that are passionate about music to inform people that actually don't have the resources to get this information otherwise, then complain that all of these young kids are learning all of these things and like outplaying a lot of us because of all of this information. Like, instead of thinking about this generation of wonderkins that we're creating just because of the wonders of the internet, and how like these people that are putting this stuff on the platform for free are lighting the torch for a brand new age of music creation. And that's not to say I don't care about the arguments about like real music being played by instrumentalists versus computer music.
Yeah.
That's dog shit.
Yep.
Mediums change all the time, I like both. So I think that's a illegitimate argument to have. Has the internet and social media been the strongest force for music education and the advancement of the next generation? Yes. And I think that a lot of us at our core are jealous and insecure because of it, because it's something that we didn't have. And so we have to make that argument of like valuing how things used to be, how, things used to be more segmented. So like Chicago would have its own sound and Texas would have its own sound without being able to like plug into Chicago instantly from my home in Winston-Salem and say, what are those cats doing? I want to learn from that. It's like there's this weird musical racism happening. And I'm not saying that like people are saying, I mean, some people say that some styles of music are better than others, like they're jazz supremacists or rock and roll supremacists or whatever. But like that segmentation or segregation when it comes to music is, now that that's being lost, music is worse, right? Worse is a value that I don't know how to quantify. So I can't tell you that. Like if there's something that you value that you feel like is being lost, okay. But you also can't deny that we are in the richest like era of like musical creation and invention. And if you don't see that, you're not looking hard enough.
Man, you said a lot of good things in there. You're right though. I mean, and like, I think that's when I try in my own mind to figure out where we are and how I feel about everything. I think there are certain stats I can pick out that reveal one thing to me, like the fact that when we watch shit that tells us that social media seems to be contributing to depression in the youth, in people in generations younger than ours, it's like, yeah, that doesn't seem good. But on the side of what you were just talking about, like the tool that the internet is and the accessibility that people now have, there's more creativity being expressed. There's this quote that someone shared with me once. It was like from one of the dudes from the founding of the country, probably, and it was like basically, I study war so that my kid can study math and science, so that their kids can study the arts and theater and music and so on. And that's like where I think we found ourselves now, as at the point where like the majority of society, if they have a working phone and internet access, they can participate in exploring creativity and music and like theater and acting and like in this little microcosm world. It's not on the big silver screen and it's not like on FM radio, but it's in this other world where we all get to share it with each other. And there's not this necessary there's not this exchange. It doesn't require the exchange of money to like do this with each other, which
At
I
least
think
not
is cool.
from us in a direct way.
Exactly.
But, the whole idea that like if something is free, you're the product. That's how social media works. But I guess that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah.
People are engaging in creativity, even and still within music, which
Absolutely.
is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not even just for music, it's thought, and I feel like if you're not seeing a diversity in thought, you're trapped in the marketing, the bubble, the algorithm that tells you that if you like this, you'll also like X, right? This is why I don't really think that there's any negative there's no inherently evil intent to social media algorithms. They're just trying to make money. And if you tell it that you've been watching this type of content, that type of content is going to continue to come up.
Yeah.
And so if I get an interest in looking at what are, what in my circles are called pickup artists, and because I heard an acquaintance or a friend, wax poetic about the reason that marriages or relationships aren't working is because the energy is disproportionate in a relationship, and in ways that, in my opinion, are just reflective of the patriarchal nature of how society has been up until this point. I want to know what the other side says, and so I'm going to look at all this content. You know, the worst thing that I do in my algorithm is start watching Tucker Carlson, and all of a sudden all this stuff comes up. And I do want to watch Tucker Carlson because I hate watching clips of things. Like I hate like just watching react videos where people can just say, "Isn't it crazy that they said insert out of context thing?" And then, you know, they make their points. And without me seeing the full context, and if I trust that person or, you know, content creator, I am more likely to agree. I mean, all of this stuff is the same in musical spaces. Hey, you should work on and only work on this technique, you know? And then you realize it's like, well, this famous person that I love never did that, and I love their sound. I mean, then you have to make a calculus in your head. If they would have known about that, would they have been better? Would that have detract from, you know, that person? And then you may make an aggregate of like that type of technique. You may look it up. And this is sort of what I do because I'm weird. But I'll look up that technique, see who else has taught it and what other people think about it. If there's anything else. And like, will it suit, like, what do they sound like? Do they use it in their own playing? And do I feel like it has a spot in my own identity as a player? And the more you do that, the more you widen, I guess, your search results versus narrow them. It's like watching or listening to a whole bunch of blues, and everything that comes is like blues players, but then you're like, man, I need to listen to more jazz. But your algorithmic ecosystem isn't catered to a variety of music. It's only catered to what you've been pressing over and over and over again.
Yeah. So I want to understand more about music for you, I think, because I do have you've said things I want to follow, but before I go there, I want to know more about your mentality with music, like how you understand what it is, like what it is for you. I'm going to try to put it as broadly as I can, and you just take it however you want.
It's changed. It you know, probably started with a validation kink. I'll put it that way. As a teenager,
if I could title this episode, it would be validation kink.
Yeah, because that seems to be with the theme of social media. It's kind of, you know, the theme, I guess. But yeah, I've never considered myself conventionally attractive. So it's one of those things where if you don't look good, if you don't seem to be attracting people, you develop a sense of humor, right? My sense of humor came much later. I started like practicing music. Because if you were good at something, then that could offset, you know, whatever capital you feel like you're losing because you feel like other people look better than you, or you're not like pretty or whatever. And so it probably started that, and it was probably because of my parents, because my dad's a musician. My dad plays organ. And he's been playing for the same church since 1990, right? That's my first gig was at that church as a drummer, and I did that for probably, I mean, as a salaried musician, I did that from 18 until about 27, 28, so almost 10 years. Once I got older, it started to become, I wanted to be good. Like, I didn't just want to play and be good because I liked when other people said that I was good. I was extremely curious about the relationships of rhythm in music. And it's not like I didn't like music. My dad always pumped really good music into my ears as a kid. But it became my mad scientist space of exploration. So I probably practiced the wrong things for a lot of years just because I was curious. And that led me to kind of where I am now. And I'm skipping a lot of things. I'm skipping the wedding bands and bar bands and my own personal process with like trying to write music and things like that. Now it's a much more, it's my access, it's my doorway to the moment. It's my doorway to probably like what I feel like being a pure, timeless existence is because whenever you're in what I mean is a flow state, this idea of meditation and sort of disassociating with the passage of time or the purposeful execution of action, you know, that is the way that I do that. And it's become more communal as well, so almost simultaneously. So however I experience oneness with my bandmates or harmony with whatever energies they're putting out while they're playing, that's what I'm about. And making sure that there's nothing in my playing, in my perspective in the moment, that is inhibiting whatever that energy manifests as. And I hate using all this flowery spiritual language, but music, as I get older, it becomes more flowery and more artistic and more spiritual.
Yeah.
And so it becomes my, let's say, reconnection to whatever spirituality I left behind whenever I stopped believing in God.
Whew. Man, yes. God, that segued so perfectly. I too have noticed that. Okay, I mean, let's just jump off there, and we can go back to some of the more music stuff. I have plenty of questions about rhythm and stuff, but this is the other thing that I just knew that this would be a jump off point for us at some point.
Okay.
I too come from a religious background. I saw you post something once, like a comment on Facebook once, that immediately told me something about your religious, about where you are, I think, religiously. Basically, it was an appeal to evidence. And I was like, I think only atheists say that. And I was like, I too came from a religious background and totally went the other way, and have found myself only more recently, like probably since COVID, looking at music as something that almost filled that space for me. And so I guess I am curious to, like, well, let me ask you this. Someone told me you like debates.
I do.
Okay. I'm going to do my best to find a way to debate you. I don't think we're going to disagree on very much, but
it's fine.
Hopefully we'll find something. But I guess to start, we'll start our debate period with what we both have in common and already agree on.
Okay.
Tell me about your whole religious thing. Like, or let me preface this one last time. I'm like fucking slowing the conversation down, but to tie it into all just one single picture, YouTube was greatly influential in my whole process of being able to learn myself away from traditional Christianity. And
right.
I wondered if you had that same experience.
100%. And I want to say, for the record, I know that there's a spectrum of Christianity. Not everyone has the same experience I had. And so when it comes to the views on science or evolution or gender or whatever, all of those, like the Black tradition, in my experience, is seeped in a type of conservatism that I was never about, even as a child, because I'm probably the only person that I know that read the Bible from cover to cover at a young age. And even I didn't really pay attention to the problematic elements until they were pointed out to me. But I was satisfied before the critical parts of my, thinking were formed, if someone gave me a book when I had a question, like, what does the Bible say about aliens? That's the one that's probably a little obscure. But if my mom would buy me a book, talks about other religions, but it would be from the perspective of Christianity, like Christianity on Buddhism, or Christianity on Islam, or Christianity about Catholicism, because my brand of Christianity actually didn't really think Catholics were real Christians,
right? That
type of thing. And that's maybe more of a Southern thing. But yeah, that's sort of where I come from, a very conservative, but also Black experience, which is a weird thing because you agree with anti-abortion, or you were against gay rights in the 90s. But at the same time, you voted Democrat specifically because of the perspective of black people and Democrats.
Interesting. I come from a background that is very similar to that. Like all the shit. Like anytime you had a question, you addressed it through that lens, and very wide experience, I'm sure, within Christianity. Conservative, Republican, Reagan type of Christian, Christian folks, who I don't have any like ill will against at all, but I too just like it didn't resonate with me.
Sure.
I constantly felt like I'm not much for uniform language, and like it probably was what drew me primarily to the arts, was just like a desire to express selfness, individuality, and oneness. And
Right.
I think for me, Christianity often felt like they were asking me to just like play along, be one of them, and it was like that's not exciting to me. That's not what my life is. That's not what's impressive about being myself. Is that I can like act just like you, kind of
Right.
thing. So how old were you when you started to sort of like find your way? How old were you when you found permission to start exploring not being that identity anymore?
When I was probably around 22 when things started to crack. But I wasn't out really until I was around 27, right? And it takes me a lot of courage to make a move. That's sort of how I've always been, because I'm weighing. I don't know why. I mean, I could think about it and probably give you some type of an answer, but I'm not a therapist, and I think that some like psychoanalyzing yourself is, I don't know, it's weird. I'll leave that to professionals. It takes me a while because I don't want to hurt my mom. I didn't want to hurt my mom. Didn't want to hurt my dad. I didn't want to fail the expectations of a family, a church family that have known me since I was 5 years old.
Yeah.
Being insulated in that type of environment where your whole community is built, and saying that I don't agree, and you are the only voice in that, like of no one else inside that community that feels the way that you feel. Maybe that's why social media is so powerful. We'll get back to that. That took me years to come to grips with and leave. And once I left it, then the courage, because I had precedent for it. I had precedent for who I was, and then stepping out with my own perspective. And maybe that's why I seem like I have my thoughts together, because what that taught me is that you can be sort of an island, and you can know at least why you have the convictions that you have. They all have equal convictions the other way, and I think that's extremely interesting. I've always been interested in, more so than why I feel like the Bible is wrong on creation, or why the Bible is wrong on the role of men and women. Like, it's more interesting that two people can live life in the same, let's take for granted that we live in the same world, right? That there is something called the real world, that we can come to completely polar opposite opinions to things. The same thing with the political divide. Watching Trump happen, and me looking at the world and what he says and having my own opinions on it, and then people screaming at the other end how either it wasn't actually like that, someone's lying to you, or it doesn't matter, right? Those were the three popular opinions defending Trump. It's what you heard about him is a lie, what you're hearing about him is true and there's something wrong with the way that you're looking at it, or what he's saying doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, either because the other side is evil and we will do whatever we can to root that evil out in the world. That's Christianity. That is Christianity. Like, whenever you talk about Jesus or whatever, it's like, and that's the only thing that matters. That there are scriptures in the Bible that talk about forsaking family for Jesus. No one does it. No one ever does it. Not really. Not the way that they like will leave family for like being a Jehovah's Witness or whatever.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah.
Right? But because it doesn't have the same type of cultish, like, exclusionary factors. There's such a broad spectrum of Christianity, and it's so rooted in community that it seems to have certain built-in emergent defense mechanisms most of the time for being an outright cult. Obviously, they're like counterexamples like Jim Jones or Waco or whatever, but most of the time things don't get too crazy. Mine was crazy though. My experience was crazy.
Your religious experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's animism, the idea that spirits can inhabit objects, or olive oil or water can have certain spiritual, like, healing properties or whatever. To the idea that not even just the animism, but you could be a puppet of Satan. Like, the devil can be using you. And the using you has always been any type of information that it's as vague as any type of information that contradicts the Bible or whatever people believe that the Bible says.
Yeah.
It can be that vague. If somebody disagrees with you, that's Satan or the devil or demons talking through you to take me off of my path and distract me from my purpose. And now I'm talking in Christianese, or at least the dialect that I was raised in. Never mind the speaking in tongues or the prayer lines. And my church got better. It went from trusting in God so much that you don't take your medicine to, hey, trust God, but also go to the doctor, which I think from where that came from is better. There's some contradictions in there, but I would much rather that than the way things used to be.
That sounds pretty deep, and that does sound like it would be quite a transformation to come out of. Like, how did it all start for you to let it go?
Do you know what sleep paralysis?
Is that the thing where you stop breathing?
No. Sleep paralysis is a weird point when you're like either falling asleep or it's a state between being asleep and being not, where all of your senses aren't completely shut off.
Are or aren't?
Are not.
Are not.
Shut. Like, you are sitting here and you have this sense of your surroundings. Maybe your eyes are open or you feel like your eyes are open, but you can't move. Like, so you feel like you're awake because you can look around, but your body is like locked in that position.
Paralysis. Yeah.
Right. But it gets weirder because you can have visual hallucinations, most of the time people, auditory hallucinations, and other sense hallucinations like falling or rising. Right. And so at a very young age, I was told in Sunday school that if that happens, that you're just supposed to call out the name of Jesus because that is a direct attack of Satan. Right? So remember, been in this my whole life, so maybe I hear this for the first time somewhere between the ages of 7 and 9. But it's reinforced many times over the years. Well, fast forward until I'm 19. Haven't heard any better. Don't know. Still a Christian. But I'm like at work. And I tell this to who is now a dear friend of mine. We've been friends for this whole time. I tell this to her and she's like, dude, that sounds like sleep paralysis. I'm like, what? Never heard the term sleep paralysis before, ever. And I look it up. Not only am I like embarrassed, because here's a person that knows nothing about my experience, basically defined everything that I was going through to the letter, and was, the internet and medical stuff, like, was on. She spelled it out, and I was like, whoa. I wonder what else is there like that I've been told that is actually a different thing. So starts the search. And what do I start with? I started with evolution, something else that the church told me that didn't actually happen because it was impossible, but I never actually looked up. Now, this is also with the emergence of the internet, right?
Yeah.
So me not yet being in the habit of being able to just type things in and learn about things, because we are just getting off of, I'm not even sure if we're on 2.0 yet. Like we're before YouTube and before all that stuff, right? I'm not even sure if the iPod has come out yet. But I hold all these things in my brain. But what I do find are debates. So the first debate that I watched was a debate between Michael Shermer and Kent Hovind.
Yeah.
And it was on, Kent Hovind reminds me of Trump a lot. But it was on evolution. Kent Hovind, very fast talker, very eloquent, does a lot, says a lot in a very short amount of time. Michael Shermer, much more laid back. And it appeared to me that in terms of presenting the information, Kent Hovind just stomped him, right? The only problem is the things that Michael Shermer said, things like, we have this, this is how radiometric dating works. Just like you have scales that are designed, like physical scales that you can put things on, that within a degree of error, a margin of error, can tell you the weight between this and its max capacity. And every radiometric dating method has a max capacity, has a range where it works. And if you use the wrong one for the wrong thing, it's going to give you inconclusive or misleading data. And I was like, that's interesting. I'm going to hold on to that. Mm-hmm. Then came Zeitgeist. You remember that? Remember that documentary, Zeitgeist?
Zeitgeist? I don't know if I saw that one.
It's glad that you didn't, because they have a lot of really bad things in there. Conspiratorial things, which I went on that trip to. But it talked about the similarities between Christianity and other ancient religions, right? Religions that I had never heard of, between the cult of Mithra and Zoroastrianism and things like that, and how the themes of Christianity, some of them predate Christianity, mm-hmm. right? Then I was like, okay, wait a minute. So if how did Christianity come into existence? So I went down that path. And so this is a long story, right?
Dude, I'm here for it. Whatever you want to say. This was my obsession for years.
Yeah,
so it's fascinating for me to hear.
Fair enough. And it's interesting going back, because I haven't been there in my mind in such a long time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what it was like to be unpacked. I can tell you that it wasn't the easiest or the most comfortable thing.
Yeah.
People think about one of the biggest things that I hear is people don't want to serve God because they want to do what they want to do. Things like that. And I'm like, okay. I've never chosen to believe. I've never chosen to believe something.
Yeah. You're usually persuaded.
Yeah,
to believe
you're either convinced or you're not.
Yeah.
And you can't control the reasons that you're convinced. You just happen to find it something compelling. So I never bought that argument, but whenever I heard, Noah's Ark not being able to actually support the amount of lives or the amount of animals that, even if you whittle them down to kinds, whatever that means, you still can't hold all of them and their food and everyone else's food without like, and water, because water would be the biggest thing. And waste management on a boat that size, let alone I guess the technology for a boat that size existing. It was a little bit too early, according to archaeologists. But what happens to sea life whenever freshwater, everything becomes saltwater? Because there are no barriers between saltwater and freshwater because the world is covered in water. So now you have all the freshwater fish are dying and all of the saltwater fish are dying because the salt levels drastically changed. So you really have no life in that way anymore. Maybe you can make an argument for deep sea life not being touched that way, but you still don't have, it's like miracle stacked on miracle. So the explanations that are not supposed to be miracles have to be miracles too. Right. And it all reads like basically any other creation story that you get from any other mythology. The idea of beings coming from clay is not original or new. That happens across the world in one way, shape, or form. The flood story also isn't just a Bible thing. Once you start putting all these pieces together, and then you start to see the ridiculousness of the talking donkey or talking snake, or the inconclusiveness of whether the snake is Satan or is it just a snake, if Satan is actually the devil or just the accuser, because that's what it means in Hebrew, because that's the role that he played in the book of Job.
Right.
And that's a completely different character than the one that you see by the time you get to Revelation. The idea that a man being transfigured into divinity is something that the Romans brought in whenever they were occupying Jerusalem, and the idea of spirit, which also isn't anywhere in the Bible, like the incorporeal ghost self. Isn't in most of the Bible, right? I don't even know if it's in any of it, to be honest, because when we talked about resurrection, in that Revelation at the end, it talked about, having new bodies, and when we talked about resurrections, you talked about the dead actually literally rising from their graves, right? And so all of these ideas, the idea of the Trinity, all of these things are interpretations that we've added towards time, right? And then they become doctrine without really us knowing. We take all those things for granted. Why should any of it be taken for granted? So that's sort of where I am with all of it, and that's how I kind of got out of it.
Yeah, man, I remember that. I remember a lot of just like that process of thinking about these things. I remember some of those days. For me, Christopher Hitchens was probably the number one most influential person in this regard. A good friend of mine, we spent like a long time debating the evolution thing. That was when I was still a Christian, and we just debated it all day long, like emails, and then we'd get together and talk about it in person, and it went on forever. And so that led me to start listening to debates between Christopher Hitchens and like William Lane Craig and like Frank Turek and all these people, including, I don't know if he ever got around to Kent Hovind, but him and the other big creation guy, there's like two big creation science guys, and I like watched their videos when I was in high school. I went to a Christian high school where I learned all this stuff and wrote papers about how evolution wasn't true or whatever.
Right.
Crazy shit. So, anywho, that led me to those debates, and it was like twice in life, often's not correct, but twice in life, I have listened to thinkers that have led me to a point where I just had to stop and like like deeply meditate on whatever it was they had led me to until I could figure out like a real fork in the road, like left or right. And I think the first point for me with like losing Christianity was Hitchens was talking about how in like 3 billion years the Andromeda galaxy is going to collide with this galaxy. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. And I had to sit there for a while like, wait a minute. As far as I believe right now, what I believe right now is Jesus will come back. Our spirit people things will leave Earth for a while, and maybe we'll go to like heaven or something. But there's something muddy and confusing about this because from what I understand, eventually we're going to bounce from some spiritual realm and return to this perfected Earth. This like, but it's going to be Earth. It's going to be here.
Sure.
And I'm like, in 3 billion years, if this galaxy is going to get eaten up by another galaxy, does that mean that God is going to, in that time period, change the laws of physics? Or did he set it off? Was the starting point that the laws of physics start off with this time frame that eventually this Earth that's supposed to be the new Earth where we'll be forever is going to get eaten up by some other galaxy? So that like opened the door to me, and I it's like it was so weird, man. It was like this other personality in my head that was like, "Hey, just so you know, if you'll just entertain this for like a second, you can step my way and see the world in the way that you're not allowing yourself to see the world. Like I'm the person that is willing to be open-minded in your brain. It was basically my cognitive dissonance. It was the person on the other side of my cognitive dissonance that was calling to me, like, you don't have to keep doing this. You can like set it down for a second.
Sure.
And when I did, it just really, all the armor started to just kind of fall off. I stopped feeling the need to constantly defend all the beliefs, that I had like kind of carried through my whole life and be unwilling to see them differently or unwilling to protect them with,
Right.
With my dear life and my identity. So yeah, man, it's really interesting, I guess, the way that we learned, how to kind of like utilize the internet to liberate ourselves from these things. So would you call yourself, are you an atheist now or an agnostic or don't want to say?
Well, it depends on what sense you mean things. People tend to get really interesting whenever you talk about atheist versus agnostic.
Yeah.
I'll give you the answer that I give most people, and I'll unpack it a little. I am atheistic when it comes to the Christian God. I am agnostic when it comes to the idea of God in general. Because I am reasonably sure enough to say that I disbelieve in the Christian God, that God or that conception of God does not exist. Right? That's in the DNA of the Bible and the history, like the anthropology of that region. I feel like that's where that points. But whenever you talk about God or being an atheist, you have to be really careful, because most of the time people will ask that question to trap you. They'll say, well, do you know everything? Say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. You're asking me what my favorite game is and then asking me if I have played all the games. No, I haven't played all of the games, but in my experience, this game is my favorite, right? And so do you wait until you know absolutely everything to make a determination? If it's impossible to do that, then nobody makes decisions or nobody believes anything.
Right.
So are we talking about absolute certainty, or are we talking about belief? If we're talking about the state of knowledge that one becomes convinced, if we can call that knowledge, if again the world is objective, I don't want to get into distinctions of knowledge versus belief. Even though that could be interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't think that God in the Christian sense exists, and I don't think that in the grand scheme we've seen a need for one to explain anything.
Yeah.
If we are using that, like the concept of God to explain things, which is the only time I've ever seen it. Now, it could be that that's how you process the events in your life. That's the other way that I've seen people utilize God or the universe or whatever, this direction or purpose for a life. And that's cool. You know, I tend to think that the life and direction and purpose is like, it's all about like choice, even if it's not solely yours. There are always forces that kind of push things in different directions, and they're bouncing like particles off against each other, and it can look chaotic and random. But who's talked about that computer, that if we had a computer big enough to read all the molecules in the universe, we could actually tell the future?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's the picture of determinism. If we had a computer that knew absolutely everything, we could at least draw maps of probability about like outcomes.
Interesting. So I used to answer similarly. I don't really get asked that question very much anymore, but for me, it always came back down with atheism. It came, or as the most recently that I can remember, it came down to the word revealed, because that's one definition of theism, is like the belief in a revealed God.
Sure.
And so that I always clung to that as like, that's part of what I take issue with, is people's certainty about God. It's whether it's Christianity or a different faith. It's like any time that every example I can think of someone who says, I saw God, like he's been revealed to me through this tradition. I've been, only because I have Christian equipment still in me that like knows what that means to some people. I know what they think they mean when they say that, and they mean it like a real personality with real intent that like they know on a personal level that oversees everything. And I'm like, sorry, bro, that hasn't been revealed to me, and like I don't think it's been revealed to us. I don't believe in a revealed God.
Right.
Of course, yes, like by default we're all technically agnostic, you know, like, and even those who claim certainty, you know, in their person, they do have some agnosticism in there floating around that they may be out of touch with.
But this is where talking about those things in those terms is meaningless, because of whether or not someone is agnostic, that doesn't actually tell you anything about what they think they believe or what they do.
True, yeah.
Right? So that's why if I seemed a little resistant to that question, if you want to give me a label, I don't mind the label atheist, but hopefully I've qualified that word enough to say that I'm not saying that I am certain, because I mean, I don't think certainty is possible, but I don't think that matters.
Yeah, I'm with you.
You said something interesting that I'd like to explore, and it's like the Christian equipment. And I think that, because I brought up a couple of times this idea of like the patriarchy or gender, and I think that whenever you have Christian equipment, even if you've given the God part away, there are these structures of thought that could stick around. Like gender roles could be one of them, where there's this polar aspects of masculine and feminine, or the way things should be, like the prescriptivist nature of like how society should run. And I guess I'm picking on Mr. Jordan Peterson at this moment, where
Interesting.
because I think he does appeal to Christians, and I think I understand why. I think that he speaks that language without overtly speaking that language, because that's kind of where he comes from. But because he's so well read, and he can speak in things like archetypes, or talk about things in, you know, sweeping very like generalizations, even if he does go to great pains to be precise with his language, I think that the people that watch him, I think he's vague enough for different interpretations, which is the religion problem again, in my opinion. You know, it's this idea that if you are sufficiently vague in any way, shape, or form, then you can take a nugget and sort of run with it, and then intentionality on his part, just like what the Bible actually says and means, doesn't matter, like in a death of the author kind of way, you know? And so people think about, you know, we'll say something like clean your room, you know, make sure that all of your matters and all of your things are taken care of. And it's like, okay, cool. That's good advice. Doesn't mean that like, I mean, but that's also not always possible, because at certain points in your life, things have to happen. And it doesn't matter what you have. I mean, I am not this, right? But I feel like being a parent is probably the most obvious manifestation of that position, right? Because no matter what you have going on, you have to make things happen for this thing. And he could say, well, that's in your room. And I'm like, okay, cool. But in my interpretation, my room is here. It's not just like the things that my responsibilities per se. It is like, it's who I am and my toxic traits and bad habits and all of these things. So do I need to make sure that I am taken care of before I take care of who I'm responsible for? It might be better for them if I had the luxury of doing that. But that luxury is not always afforded to us. I mean, sometimes it is if you're in a different income bracket, right? And I don't know how much money he makes, but we have to be careful not to look at something that we like and then create dogma from it. That to me is a Christian problem. That to me is the atheist problem. It's the problem of dogma is also the political problem. That might be the thing that I discovered after coming out of Christianity that makes me critical of everything. It's not the belief itself, even though I disagree with it. It's the fact that believing certain things makes you resistant to certain flows of information.
Yes, sir. So I think we will be able to find where we part ways in here somewhere, and it won't be too drastic, I don't think. But this is well timed, almost, because I think the podcast that comes out tomorrow, me and a guest talk favorably about Jordan Peterson, kind of like try to unpack that, because he was actually, glad you brought him up. He was the second person who had that sort of fork in the road impact on me. So I fuck with him a lot, but more importantly, like, he's not the heart of the where we might where we might split ways. What's at the heart of where we might split ways is actually somewhere where we come close to agreeing. Dogma versus, I think, ideology. I think there are some people who think that it's dogmatic belief, that can be found in many different belief systems. That's the problem, as you just laid out. And I think I find myself in a camp of believing that it's like patterns and system of beliefs themselves, which we call ideologies, that I think is the number one problem.
Can you sort that out for me?
Yeah. So I guess like the best way I could express it is as we've been kind of hinting around, like instead of the like the Christian equipment thing. Well, let me back up as far as I possibly can. I think that the way that we have to believe information is what informs where these belief systems kind of come from. So I think like it wasn't like Christianity taught us how to believe things in a particular way. It was that we believe things in a particular way. Christianity streamlined that very well, as like all these other beliefs did. But now, on the other side of, I would argue, on the other side of the 20th century, due to modernity, due to like how we are now and the things that we've learned, we are kind of filling that void with other types of identities and ideologies, like political beliefs. So I think in a patterned way across sort of the culture, people are filling the void that is left by the absence of what was like years and years and years of traditional religion, filling that void with other patterns that match it. I personally think that liberalism and all the categories underneath liberalism are straight up religions. And I think like the same thing about republicanism and conservatism. Like, I think all these belief systems are religions, and that, like, in subscribing to them, we become ideologues. And I think that that's our great failure right now. Instead of kind of being where in that space that you were just talking about, like being open to different beliefs, and rejecting dogma. I don't think it's the dogma that makes the belief system corrupt. I think it's the belief system, the need to attach your identity to a belief system that's corrupt.
Okay. That makes sense. There are two ways we can go about that. We can talk about beliefs as beliefs hijacking evolutionary imperatives to trust your parents.
Yeah.
And the other is what you said maps just so long as the dogmas or the beliefs themselves aren't on their faces harmful.
That can you say that one more time?
So if the dogma is harmful, then I think that is a problem, and that could be a problem more than an ideology, right? The link is belief, like just like in Christianity, and you have to believe that this is true, a natural, or should be a natural state of the world, and it's something that you have to bring about through action, right? It's one of the things that makes non-crazy Christians not crazy. This idea that, even though the Bible says it, it's not necessarily literal, and that literal reading, if that were done, that would be harmful, right? So that way, dogma, that is the one case that you could be wrong, in my opinion, if that dogma is harmful. So let's go back to the first one. The first one being belief as how did I phrase it before? As an evolutionary imperative, because survival is often based on, or was based on, children listening to their parents. I mean, because the parents' role in whatever society looked like was the protection and the thriving of their children. Whether or not it was for status or for raising workers to work on a farm, the parents were invested in their children's survival, or at least having a sufficient amount of children that the odds of some of them surviving was higher than them not having children, which is why you had bigger families, because you didn't have the health care and, you didn't have the systems. So, I mean, a lot of places around the world still don't have those systems, but on average, life expectancy has gone up this whole time on our planet. So let's just assume that conditions on average are getting better, and for that reason, families' sizes get smaller. You don't have to have as many kids to have more kids to survive. But if all of those things mean that bad ideas get spread, like, it's not just that all the good things that you tell your children help them survive, but as long as the bad things aren't inhibiting that survival, that is going to, in an evolutionary perspective, transfer as like an evolutionarily neutral trait. That's why, you have, vestigial organs and things that either are repurposed or are no longer used, but they're still there, or remnants are still there, because it's not actually a detriment. It's not it's not giving a disadvantage to whatever organism, right? So if you think about society in that terms, you have just things carrying over, and a lot of things that don't really have any point. Now, you say that the political spectrum, or a political caste system that we have, I guess, is is a religion. And I just want to make clear that I don't think that if you mean that their religions because people seem to think really strongly and they identify with those things in that kind of a deep way, and those things influence their communities, the type of people that they hang out with, and other decisions that they make in their lives, fair enough. I hate using the word religion because the word religion, besides the word culture doesn't bring in the spiritual element. Yeah. Right? It doesn't say anything about us existentially, about why we're here or what happens after we die. That's why I don't like using that word. So I often use the sports team analogy. I don't consider sports a religion, even though I know people that claim to be Christians that know more about the history of their favorite sports team than they do about the Bible.
Yeah.
But the point with politics is if any one side actually has the ability to be right or wrong. I feel like whenever we talk about ideology, we don't talk about the facts. We never talk about the material conditions. We always talk about people's tendencies to be biased or to identify. And we neglect whether or not, let's say, drone strikes are bad, or, Trump was or was not, if he was a racist or merely an opportunist, and what is the evidence against those things, if the drug war should stop, and what the material conditions are surrounding that issue, who are the people being most affected by certain policies and why, right? If all political conversations, and they won't be, but if all political conversations were reduced to the facts on the ground, then we would have much different and more substantial conversations, rather than I don't like your team because your team is racist, or your team is destroying the family through weird gender politics, or your team likes to cancel celebrities.
Interesting. To the first point, the family issue, I think, is very interesting and very cool, and I think is a great area in which to plug in the word culture, because it's weird, man. It's like this romantic view of previous cultures was all about sort of individuation and sort of making someone, of course, you try to treat you like, from what my limited wealth that I can pull from on more ancient cultures than ours, there was more of as far as I understand, an appreciation for elders in a different way, appreciation for staying a part of that culture, but still this huge emphasis on transitioning into adulthood, into your own person capable of handling your own identity,
sure,
which we don't have as much of. And I remember within my Christianity and sort of what we talked about, maybe about the role that is played by a young person sort of coming up and discovering maybe that they don't relate with this religious thing anymore. This weird pressure to be like, my parents aren't going to like this, and it's going to hurt them deeply. And that is a really uncomfortable thing and an interesting way to compare these things. But maybe jumping over to the meatier part of it.
Can I make one comment?
Sure.
Because of the elders thing, I feel like at least part of that has to do with the fact that they were keepers of knowledge and wisdom in the tribes or whatever social structure existed back then. Yeah. There was no way of getting certain information without talking to someone older, because there was no internet. Go far enough, there weren't books, but
right.
But now with the internet, it is possible, at least on an information level, for children to know more about certain topics than their parents.
Yeah, that's really
what
interesting.
Has that done to our society?
Yeah, I had never thought about that. I want to remember to come back to the sports team thing, but I don't know if you noticed this in the way things are unfolding culturally right now, but there are really rampant anti-older people sentiments out there, and I hear a lot of these people can walk off a bridge, or these people not, and it's it's different. I think when we were kids, it might have been there's definitely some of that. Everybody, I think, who's young experiences what that feels like to kind of resent this idea that you think your parents are smarter than you, and you want to prove that that's not true. But it feel like what you just described is very interesting because it feels like there's a lot of disdain for everything that represents the past.
Maybe, but at the same time, like maybe I'm an optimist, you know, but to say something is funny or you find something funny, like young people are saying they are literally dead. Being literally dead means being on the floor in stitches laughing, right? It is not LOL, it is I am dead. And they have co-opted the, skull and crossbones to mean something is funny. And I don't know how much of that translates, to how people are perceiving the sentiment, or if they've just been expressing what all generations express. I noticed way before Gen Z, because I feel like that's more of a Gen Z thing, the hatred from millennials from boomers. Like before TikTok and before where we are, I saw fucking millennials memes, like the classic text memes about, and so I really just think that to the extent that has what you mentioned is turned up to 11, I feel like everything is turned up to 11.
Yeah, maybe so. I'd like to think on that more before I take any guesses. So I'll jump back to what drew me in the most. I guess the distinction between like a team fan like fanatic, I feel like whether that's what people are doing on a political level or something more like religion. I think the reason I use religion, do you fuck with John McWhorter at all?
I don't know who that is.
He's very interesting. A lot of people probably hate him by now. He's because he's like really, he's the first person I ever heard do a speech on like the anti-racism ideology, and he believes that it's harmful, and
let's talk about that.
We can get into that. He's a black journalist and teacher and stuff.
Okay.
Really smart guy, but he believes that like anti-racism is a religion, and Hitchens believed that this all started when Hitchens pointed out that like environmentalist end of the worlders, he thought seemed like a religion.
Sure.
And I started like noticing other people describing other things as reminding them of religion. And I started to think that, okay, I started to just sit there and be like, all right, we all know that like if you take on a certain identity, like liberal, it comes with all these beliefs. And so they're not yours. You're just subscribing to these beliefs.
Sure.
And do they stack up in the same way that like Jesus and Mary and the devil and God and all these things stack up within Christianity? And what I started to do is just sit there as a hobby and like write them all out. Like, what is the devil to liberalism? What is the devil and Jesus and salvation to feminism? What is the devil and all these different things, all these different ways of deciding what your number one thing is that you're going to pursue. It's the same thing you were talking about earlier about that is like how conservatism is Christianity and how it's like, trying to save the world from despair and point you toward whatever. That's what I think all ideologies do. And I think in a way they become faith-based because they all have cognitive dissonance in them, because they're all unwilling to see what challenges them in some way. Like not everybody who has an ideology is practicing hardcore cognitive dissonance, but I think that everybody who identifies deeply with an ideology is willing to like let some information go in the name of pursuing the thing they're trying to pursue, which I think is pretty much what it means to have faith.
I think that depends. I think that depends on the distribution of so in science there is something called error bars or margin of error, where something can be certain within the degree of certainty, not 100% certainty, but within a degree. And that degree, that tolerance degree, is usually in the calculus of whatever theory or whatever formula that you're working with in order to describe a certain phenomenon. Now, let's talk about COVID.
Okay.
COVID, I think, is a great example because a lot of times when people talk about COVID, they talk about their personal history as being evidence against whatever the opposing view is.
Yeah.
I'm trying to say this as neutrally as possible.
Yeah.
So, but without really understanding the distribution of data and where the bell curve is, you don't know where your experience falls on the bell curve. Everyone feels like their experience falls at the top of the bell curve, and they think that things on the edges of the bell curve are evidence against. And that's just not how statistics work. That's not how data works. And so in so much as you were ignoring counter information, we just have to make sure that counter information isn't a part of the equation, right? I don't see as things that happen that aren't the thing that I'm talking about. Sometimes it is. You can point to a study or a data point that disputes something. But if I tell you, look, it's possible for the Arctic to gain ice, but us still have a net ice loss on the planet, those two things can happen at the same time because there's more than just the ice in the Arctic that is in that calculus. Then what does that do to the argument of against climate change? Right. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, what I find when I talk to somebody is that they move without acknowledging that. They'll just say another point. They'll just give me another argument without that refuted argument ever working into the calculus of whether or not something should be believed. Mm-hmm. And if that's what you mean by ideology, I agree.
It would take some effort to pinpoint exactly what I mean by ideology. I think that's a really good example of the cognitive dissonance that I think I'm trying to describe, like where, and I notice it. I don't know, like we all remember when that dude in Congress like had a snowball and was like,
yeah.
You say it's global warming, I've got a snowball.
Sure.
What you're talking about reminds me of that. It's just like a pointless misunderstanding of, the topic at hand.
But everything that I feel like you may call liberalism, which is an interesting thing because from my perspective, the thing that ties liberalism is capitalism, not culture war. Because but that's another conversation. I'm a little bit left of that. But I think that you can say the distinction from your example is climate versus weather, right? You could think about the race thing because I really want to get into that. The race thing as being like racism versus racists, or you could think about gender versus sex. Like all of these things not necessarily being indicators of a phenomenon, but not being equal to. And so I really want to know what this person says.
Sure. I mean, we can talk about it. I guess I'll acknowledge first how uncomfortable it makes me to talk about race, just because I don't know, especially at this stage where there's a lot of folks who feel like I guess I'll just say it like this, man. I'll be as honest with you as I can, and like it's whatever. We're here to talk to each other.
I'm fine.
What makes me uncomfortable is like not knowing when I'm talking to somebody whether they assume that like my ethnicity in this conversation is going to inform it in a negative or like super biased way, as if I have some kind of hostility that I'm working with that I'm either aware of or not aware of, that is going to like limit how open-minded I am.
I wish I had a piece of paper. I've already heard you say something that I want to unpack.
Okay. Point being, I hope, I think I already know that it is the case, but I just hope you know that like I'm trying to operate in this conversation with goodwill and with not.
I hope my smile isn't like condescending at all. Like you're fine. I just feel like maybe I agree with whoever said this, whoever you're talking about or wherever you're getting some of this stuff from. But I think that the single worst thing that has happened is that all of this language has become so muddled, and we are so afraid
Yeah.
to talk about it. Like that, the fact that, and I've heard people say that I disagree with about other things, but one thing I do agree with is like, why in the world do you have to caveat everything that you have to say? Is like, in order to not sound like a racist, you have to say, well, you have to assume ignorance in certain ways. And it's like, at some level, isn't that built into every single conversation? Unless you're, a degreed sociologist that studied this stuff, specifically like critical race issues and all this thing. Like, dude, this is a podcast. We're in the middle of, wherever.
Yeah.
Who cares? I mean, somebody on the internet might care, but I'm saying for me, I am your black friend in this conversation. So yeah,
That's how I feel too. And it's like, it shouldn't be. It should be. I want us to have this conversation, but I just, I don't know. I feel this pressure sometimes to try to express that something. Pretty much exactly what you just laid out. So,
and I will try my best. Emphasis on the word "try," to not make you uncomfortable because I find it fun.
no, and that here's caveat number 2. I'm also not asking you to make it any easier on me.
Fair enough.
So, no, have the conversation you want to have. Okay. John McWhorter, I can't boil down as perfectly as I wish. I just rewatched his debate. I watched his debate and another thing, a speech at like Berkeley somewhere by like a socialist professor that was like about how wokeism doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to.
Sure.
And basically how like her main point, I think, was that the majority of black Americans don't seem to statistically don't seem to really identify with progressivism in some of the ways that it expresses itself. Mm-hmm. John McWhorter's thing is more like what I just laid out. He's like, these ideas about certain privileges and certain ways that we talk about race and how we mean to address it, mm-hmm. It is a religious belief, and that it like is missing the mark, and that it isn't accomplishing anything that actually is helping black Americans out. And his big thing is like that. Jesus, I don't want to say too much. I'd rather share the debate with you. But his thing is that if we look at the issue of basically race relations through a lens that is religious that we're not aware of, if we are practicing this cognitive dissonance that we're not aware of, that's where we're doing the damage, because we're not able to have the type of constructive or beneficial conversations about where we go from here that we need to have if we're doing it by excluding certain information.
Fair enough. Then what do you think about representation?
What do I think about representation? Meaning like sort of what comes to mind?
Fair enough.
Like,
so let's talk about media representation. Most of the time people don't tend to care that much about who is in office as far as their skin color. I mean, some people do, but that's always a subset of people. Like, more people pay attention to entertainment. So I'm talking about entertainment. Mm-hmm. You have a black Superman, say, mm-hmm. right? That I've seen people go nuts because a historically white character will be race changed.
Yeah.
And because under the banner of representation.
Yeah.
Right. Or I'll see platforms like Hulu or Netflix or Prime boost to the top things about like Black or Latinx creators. What do you think about that?
Well, I think a lot of things. Let's see. First, I will say representation. My first thought is that I respond positively to it sometimes. Like, I don't know if you know this, but I'm quarter Cuban.
Okay.
And that's something that I really like about my background, like mm-hmm. that my grandmother's Cuban. And there's this comedian I like who's Cuban. And the fact that he's Cuban adds to the reason that I like him. It's just like this glimpse into that part of my identity.
Sure.
And so he gives him this leg up from other comedians. And when I think about, like, I don't know, when there's debates about gender and stuff, and we think about women participating in fields that have usually been mostly made up of men, I respond positively to that the same way that I do men being in fields that have usually been mostly made up of women. I think when it comes to media, like what we're talking about, okay, here's a good one. I think sometimes it lands as like a representation of virtue for a particular company, or just like a bad idea. Like when creativity, I guess the best way to say it is when I get the sense that I'm watching like political statements be made through art, then I consider that pandering in a way, or consider it sort of like lazier or something. When you compare like I don't know, like the all female Ghostbusters movie, and I never saw it, but like just the idea that they needed to remake that compared to, say, what they've done with Spider-Man or what they've done with Black Panther. These movies, I don't see those. Those don't feel like political language is being expressed at all. They just feel like creative language. Whereas I will admit, like something like the Ghostbusters thing, I think it's like the fact that it wasn't a more original creation, and it was just like, we're gonna pull out the male characters and put in the female characters, feels a little more like, well, I think it would just be more interesting if it was like a new story. I think that's the way I've heard it expressed by some people, and I think sometimes I feel that way about some shit.
Okay. So I would say that, like, if we want to talk about gender or gender theory, I think a gender theorist would say it's interesting that society fixated on Ghostbusters being an all-female production with those same arguments. Not that those arguments don't exist for other things. For other, like, there are 3 Little Womens, right? Or there it's not that I haven't heard the criticism about how many Batman movies there are. You know, it's just that one of those things we have, one of those areas we consider a matter of course, and we highlight others. Why do we seem to care or pay attention to an all-female cast? And why does that have disproportionate negativity towards it? Versus other bad movies, versus other bad remakes, and the like, right? That's what I feel like a gender theorist might say, right? Because in most cases, the thing is the fact that they're women. Now, there are 2 ways that you can go with that for me. There is the reaction to what you feel like are politically motivated reasons. To which I say, fair enough. If you want to talk about media during the height of the Me Too movement, then Ghostbusters is there. And if you want to think about that as a cynical cash grab from the studio, you want to think about that as like a badly written movie that they feel like, and that was just happened to be part of that narrative, and that was hollow and cheap. Cool, but that's not representative of the entire amount of pushback. And in that wave, you had people calling Leslie Jones a gorilla. You had all of this other stuff. And so you have this vitriol as being a vehicle for much darker elements to it. And so whenever someone on my side talks about that, it's not just about the ability to criticize some things or others. It's the type of criticism and what that ushers, right? The idea that even though speech, this is where we sort of started, even though speech is free, it's really, really powerful and therefore not benign. And so what is the consequence of fallout of certain types of speech in certain arenas, right? And so the benefits of representation, a bunch of, women came together and made a bad movie. I hope they make shit tons more bad movies, because I think that the representation and them being present in the industry will allow for more good female, all casted female, like Euphoria. Like, let's talk about female content I love. Fleabag, Euphoria. I mean, there are there's tons of content out there, but we never really talk about that because we always end up, Ghostbusters came out in 2016. It's very telling that, like, that still ends up being a topic of conversation, even though shitty movies have come out since. Like, to me, much more egregious than Ghostbusters was for the last Fantastic Four movie. Nobody talks about that. Even though to me it was, I love Fantastic Four. I'm sorry. That's Marvel's first family. I fuck with them. Or Suicide Squad.
Yeah.
Right? Which was, to me, worse because at least at times Channing Tatum was funny in Ghostbusters 2016. There was I think, in my opinion, the first Suicide Squad was the most joyless thing that I've seen in a long time. So why do we fixate in certain directions versus others?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think there's something. This is going to be sticky, and it's probably I've never really expressed these ideas out loud, so I don't know how well this is going to come out. But for me, often art that works. I mean, way back, art that works tends to not always, but often represent a harmony between like masculine and feminine. And especially, I think, in story form, like in movie world, I think that's usually how it goes. Now, what people take issue with, it seems, is the fact that the masculine characters are often that role is filled by men, and the feminine characters are filled by women in like traditional story form. So you can think of like Lion King, or you could think of Legends of the Fall, or you could think of 1,000 other movies.
Sure.
That the story centers around the problems of the female, the problems of the male, and the way that they kind of like navigate that world and either find harmony with each other, or sometimes maybe it doesn't result in them finding harmony. And the sad truth of the story is that in this situation, they did not find harmony with each other. I think the reason that gender gets brought up in this realm, like we could probably come up with a couple other examples of at least some of them that have got past me, but I just like have seen people criticize certain movies, and we're all aware of what happens as people have like kind of expressed a distaste for a lot of these movies that maybe represent what some people would call either wokeness or progressivism or some kind of agenda. I think that like with some of these examples, there's a real sort of like, this movie is about femininity, sort of like taking the forefront and putting masculinity in the back of the picture.
Okay.
And I think that is understandable to express when like your perception of the world is that masculinity usually has precedence over femininity. But I think in the rules of art and the rules of storytelling, I think that's why it doesn't feel good usually, because like it's breaking the rule of what the harmony represents.
So I'm tickled that you went down masculinity and femininity, because God, me and John had that conversation years ago.
Oh, yeah.
There's some things that be had, but so it really just depends on your media, man. Like, we talked about women-centric things, and I'm really embarrassed that I forgot to talk about like Atomic Blonde and The Witcher, and and even like Black Widow. As much as whatever you feel like about that movie, like that movie was very driven by women, and I feel like women that embody whatever you would consider a masculine energy. But so when we talk about masculine and feminine energy, I understand the utility of the framing. I just don't have any use for it. Because it's something that I feel like that's part of our Christian programming, from at least here, I think, because there's nothing except for historical precedent as far as like the way that power structures in certain societies function, and the fact that there's no difference between a male and a female brain, that those aspects of ourselves should be polar. I just see a lot of woo around the fact that like polarity exists, so like masculine and feminine are true when spectrums also exist, and it seems to be a useful frame for some people, but it's just not backed by sociology or any type of real rigorous study in any type of meaningful way for me to it's a story. It's a frame, and again, I understand it. It's just not one I buy.
I hear that. I mean, I do know that men and women are more alike, than they are different, broadly speaking. I do think on a psychological level, they do like have some pretty major differences, at least from the people I've heard that are supposed to be authorities on this issue, like whether they're aggressive or not, the degree to which they're aggressive compared to the degree to which they're maybe agreeable or shit like that.
But I'm not denying any of that. I am talking about the labeling of certain traits being masculine and feminine.
Yeah, I hear that for sure. Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it's something that belongs, I guess, to us. I mean, I think there's like, it's a way to categorize observations. Like the same way that I think like female lions are the ones that do most of the hunting, and the male lions like do a lot of the roaring and ass kicking or whatever. I think like we observe behaviors in our species as well, and then we like assign those in some ways to the categories that they most usually belong to or have traditionally according to the way that we've organized things.
Right. And so we have to figure out if those structures are useful to us. Mm-hmm. That's this whole idea of conservatism and progressivism is conservatism tends towards the traditional, and the progressivism tends towards deconstruction. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I am only interested I'm interested in deconstruction. I mean, if you want to talk about the way I look at drums, if we want to tie this all the way back to my, like how I view music and what inspires me, it's when people take non-traditional things or repurpose traditional things in interesting ways.
Yeah.
I like subversive deconstructionist media, from movies to I'm a huge anime fan, music, anything like that usually grabs my interest. I have very little interest in musical traditions on just by themselves. I am interested in what they can teach us, but I am always thinking about theft. I'm always thinking about stealing something that I like to repurpose, not bowing to the gods of the past.
Yeah. I do hear that. I hear it 100%. And I know that this is a difference between us, I'm sure, because I think on this side of religion and stuff for me, I think I have returned a bit more to like, and honestly, because of that dude you brought up, because like, I think in my atheism, I was pointed at a deconstructionist sort of mentality for a long time. And it was because of fucking Jordan Peterson that he provided that language that you described earlier that made me look at it differently. And so not because of him, I didn't just subscribe to him,
right,
but in my own way, I had to like kind of figure out where I stood. And I think since then I have probably evolved to be, I have probably adjusted in my own person to be a little bit more whatever. I've brought conservatism back into my person now, into my thinking, and I think that so I guess when we're talking about constructionism and stuff, I'm not somebody who believes that we created society and that it like confines us in the ways and constructs all of our behaviors. I think that our behaviors resulted in society and resulted in culture. So I guess when we talk about art and we talk about things that maybe these constructs that we might have, like terms like masculine and feminine, it's hard for me to at this point, it's hard for me to look at the last like 1,000 years and be like, those generations were wrong because our generation now has the right idea for what needs to come next. I don't want to discredit the wisdom of all those generations that led us to this point.
So we are there finally. If you want to talk about where we part.
Yeah.
Because I don't look at the things that they know and necessarily call it wisdom. Especially if we're talking about 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Because you have wisdom. Obviously you have wisdom. I'm not saying that you don't, but you also have slavery. Right. And before we get into, I'm not saying that you're going to do this, but I could imagine someone that's a little bit less savvy, like sitting in front of me and using in a slavery apologist line, like, well, that was their tradition or they didn't know any better. Right. Then I'm like, okay, then I guess then society at some points do progress and we do know better, because we have to agree that not having slaves or people not being enslaved is obviously better than being enslaved, right? Yeah. So there has to be some way that we do know better than the 1,000 years of human history, right? So yes. What are those things? How do we deconstruct, examine, and figure out the behaviors of what we're doing now, even, or 50 years ago, and say we might be fine without that?
I mean, yeah, the example you gave is a great example of how we just, that was a foolishness, that we that was a good thing that we got past that point in our at least we in a lot of the world. It's not like it doesn't still go on in the world, and arguably, possibly, in some way or another, still in America. So slavery is not a reality that we're like free of totally in the world. But I mean, I guess on the opposite side, a different example that comes to mind is like, this is a weird territory. I can't believe everything that we're covering, but like the Christian emphasis on traditional family. And It's like, is that a useful institution or not, or whatever? And it's like, just in the groups of people that I know in my immediate life, there's so much more of a willingness, I think, to entertain lifestyles now that are like pansexual and like these things where people have multiple partners or whatever. Polyamory. So there's a question there of like, if it's, we're not the first generation to ever explore these things, but sure, where does that emphasis on traditional family structures, on like monogamy and stuff, do they come from a wise place? And I think personally, I used to feel more like open-minded about being like, that's silly or whatever. But I think I'm reaching a point now where I'm like, that probably was something that we learned for a reason.
Is polyamory?
No, monogamy. Yeah.
So you have to decouple the idea of marriage as the transaction of material goods from, like, that's a big part. You have to reconcile that marriage wasn't really about love, or sometimes it wasn't even about the children itself. It was about the families being involved in economic conditions that the relationship between those two families had. Because we have to remember that not everyone could be married, because with dowries, there was a financial gap. There was a cap, like a financial gate between like who could get married and who couldn't. So that's the first thing. Like, it's interesting and awesome to sort of wax poetic against, like, I mean, towards our favorite things, but I feel like denying historical context kind of muddies the water a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, but what you made me think of just now, when I think of something like where monogamy comes from, I'm not thinking of it like from the 1400s or some shit like that.
Okay.
I'm thinking of it from like 200,000 years ago. I'm trying to anything like this,
Well,
like
200,000 years ago, we weren't monogamous.
well, I don't really know.
Well, I can tell you, we were small, polyamorous, like nomadic groups of proto-humans.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking of, I mean, roughly 150,000 years ago. If we're talking about humans, do you know when monogamy started to be a thing?
That I don't know.
Okay.
That I don't know. The only thing that I do know is like I can say fairly safely from like biblical times on, but it's harder to, because it's not like people haven't been pairing, but even in the Bible, even the Bible had legal concubines. It wasn't until the New Testament that monogamy was pushed, right? So, I mean, if you want to talk about the birth of monogamy in Judeo-Christian culture, we have to talk about it starting from the New Testament.
Well, let's simplify it down a little bit more. So I'll say it like this. Taking monogamy out of the equation, with all of these issues, with tribalism of different sorts, including racism, with sexism, with all of it, I try to figure out how much of this can be traced back to our lowly origins as a species rather than Western society or Western civilization or whatever, because I think that there's a really healthy diet right now of like blaming a lot of our current problems on civilization itself, and I
Sure.
think like we miss the stuff that came before it, and I want to do that in a positive and negative way. I want to like ask, wait a second, what are we practicing that we've always practiced, and what are we practicing that we've always practiced, and what have we avoided from the start for good reason? I think that's what I'm trying to get in touch with.
I know. And I think that could be useful as in so much as it informs us about ourselves. So the ancient stuff is important because those evolutionary tendencies are still in us. A great example would be our relationship to sugar. I don't have to talk about that. That's easy. Food used to be finite. Now it's not. Our bodies know to crave glucose because it keeps us alive, and it used to not be in such. It used to not be so abundant. Our brains have not made the evolutionary jump to a much more what's the word, a like food rich society. So we have obesity because our need for glucose, or at least what it triggers in our that rush, is maladaptive to our circumstances, right?
Yeah.
What you're saying is monogamy, you have a feeling that monogamy is useful. I'm saying it could be useful, but it could also be maladaptive, because there could be historical reasons that monogamy has thrived as, let's say, in so much as it's possible to create a stable environment for raising children.
Yeah.
Right. Which begs the question, what about couples that don't want to have kids? But we won't go there for now. I wonder then where it takes a village comes from, and in the climate of, being able to work and actually not support your family due to economic conditions, whether or not the type of work that you can do is in demand enough to give you the amount of money that it takes for you to live in this area that you live. And if it's actually possible to relocate. In those circumstances, does it make it easier or harder? And I think I read a study about the two-parent household, at least the traditional household, actually being more of an income thing, not a division of labor thing, versus it being a man and a woman raising children. Because of what it seems to be is as long as one person seems to be more available to the children and one person can concentrate on resource accumulation, and then it provides for a much stabler household than one person trying to do double duty. What we have not studied is a shared pool of resource earners and caretakers, and how that affects raising children. We actually don't know. So I can't tell you that I have this sense that polyamory, being in a pod, would be better or worse for a child, because we would have to see how they deal with the inner dynamics of cross-pollination.
Poly.
Yeah. And how the attention and the division of labor works in that dynamic.
Yeah.
That might be out there, but I'm completely ignorant to it. So I can't tell you that that's better or worse than a traditional monogamous relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Do you think that, given that you talk about deconstruction, like, and I can see it as you look through these things, like, you sound very comfortable, just like you can rip something apart,
but also tell you I don't know.
yeah, which I respect totally. But do you think that I guess like, does that give you any? Does that put in any sort of bias to be anti-traditional? Do you think that that's a thing that you navigate at all?
I think something either works, it doesn't, or it's inevitable. Guns are a great example.
You say guns?
Guns are a great example. If so much. So it's been proven that fewer guns lead to fewer suicide. Like the idea that like somebody will just figure out a way to kill themselves is bunk. Because a lot of suicides are, impulsive, and we tend towards things that are instant and what we perceive as painless. And if there is pain and it's not instant, people actually opt out of killing themselves as an impulse. So by the reduction of guns, you actually have a reduction in suicide. That alone, depending on all other things being equal, because we don't know what that does to crimes and break-ins and blah, blah, blah. And there's the argument is like, well, that's just taking guns out of like lawful, law-abiding people. Like I'm saying all of those things being the same, if we talk about suicide in particular, you would say that obviously we need to reduce the amount of guns in the population, specifically for men, because that is a statistic that disproportionately affects men. Men kill themselves like more than women in this country, right? Suicide is a man issue.
Yeah.
That might introduce a little bit of dissonance depending on how you feel about the Second Amendment and guns or whatever. But if we could point to a causal link, so what should you do about it? Should I become a anti-gun or a gun control advocate? That depends on how much I feel like doing that thing would actually help.
Yeah.
So if I think, yes, the world would be better without guns, but I feel like that's impossible, then I'm sort of stuck. I'm not going to start advocating having no guns, because that just makes me look silly. It's interesting to imagine a world that looks like that. Sure, I could talk about it, but I mean, that's almost like denying the reality, and it has nothing to do with tradition.
Yeah, I hear that. Man, I guess I probably have to start wrapping this up, and I don't want to at all.
This might be like a two-parter.
It might be. I love it. This is like my favorite shit ever. I at least have to ask you, I guess, to lead into my last question or whatever. Do you call yourself do you ever call yourself a materialist? Do you think of yourself as a materialist?
What do you mean by materialist?
When I was a super like anti-theist, I believed sort of in a Hitchians or Harris kind of way, like the world is matter. It's just like physical matter, and that's all that there is. And so all spirituality and it's kind of horseshit kind of vibe.
Sure. Do you think the video game, like the experience of playing Super Mario Brothers, is a materialist experience? Because what you're playing like is an abstraction of binary at a certain point.
That's a great example. I would say, I mean, at this stage, I would say no. I'm not a materialist anymore.
Okay.
But that I never thought of that example. The thing that challenged me the most was the word potential. That one was like when I started thinking about the word potential and the idea of somebody having a potential but not realizing it, I was like, shit. That's a real, like, that's something that I can observe that is not material. And so it kind of changed my attitude about that. But I guess,
Are you talking about actual potential or perceived potential?
I guess like, I mean, I don't know. I'm not really sure, but I guess it's like, I don't know. Like, I think about it in terms of musicians or like musicians and creative people quite a lot. Like, my own potential to like have an audience and go play shows or whatever, and the fact that I have to like do things and communicate with people and like be in the realm of ideas and commitment and bullshit like that.
Sure.
In order to create the environment that would allow me to reach this potential that I might have as an artist. All that shit is like not physical. I don't know if that's potential or.
I mean, what you're talking about is whether or not the future exists.
I guess so.
I mean, that's what I'm hearing. I'm saying, like, is the future there and is it set? If it's not, because if the future is set, then potential doesn't exist, because it is actual. Like, it's the same. It's part of the same four-dimensional object, kind of like in like a Donnie Darko sense. Remember when the thing comes out and starts tracing its path? That's basically what that's outlining. It's outlining the fact that as four-dimensional beings, we have a coordinate in space-time, not just space. And so if you looked at every place that we've been, we wouldn't be this thing, but we would be a worm because it's all blending together in the path of where we've been in time too, right? And so if the space-time exists in that sense and the future is there, then everything that you said points towards materialism because that is there. It's just that the way that we perceive time is in that direction. So it really just depends on your perspective.
Yeah. I'm going to have to listen back to that portion and think about that a lot because that presents me with some problems, I guess. But I guess on a functional level, I kind of have leaned into pragmatism more personally, which is just, I just, whatever. I don't care. Who cares?
That's how these conversations end. Let me answer your question. I think that I tend to think that life and consciousness is an emergent property of the material conditions of the universe. So in that way, I'm a materialist.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think that in so much as we observe things, that our observations are the things that create reality. That seems to be working backwards, and we don't actually we know more information going one way than we do the other. I'm not saying that we know everything about the emergence of consciousness. That would be stupid, but we do know that consciousness correlates to the brain. We don't know, we wouldn't have the first clue of understanding how observations as, conscious beings create matter.
Okay. Again, that I'll just have to think on that because my mind has been all about like behavioral, sort of like, I'm no psychologist, but it's more like focused on questions about behavioral psychology.
Sure.
That sounds more theoretical,
No, it's neuroscience. It's like the mind. The mind is what the brain does.
Right. Yeah. Because I feel like that. Well, that is really the discussion between, say, a certain popular behavioral psychologist and Sam Harris. It's
Sure.
like, what does it boil down to? Does it boil down to behavior? Does it boil down to the mind and the brain? And it sounds like you fuck with some of the Sam Harris neuroscience side of that. And I am probably just blind to a lot of that. I have to like spend some time doing some homework on really formulating personal opinions about that.
Sure.
But I do for me personally, I started to find the more that I like leaned into the material stuff of like the world and deconstructing my ties to traditionalism, my artistic voice became less stable. It still existed, but I found that I was like driven to, as a songwriter, driven to like write songs about different things and go into different places. And I think the big question is sort of like, what is creativity and art and all this stuff that feels like we started the conversation with, in part, feels spiritual in a way, feels like deep and meaningful and like different in a way than science. And what is it in this world of all these beliefs that kind of deconstruct tradition and beliefs and stuff?
Because we seem to value identity so much, we tend to impose it on the things that we do. And it's not just that I am who I am, like I am what I create in that way. So whenever we talk about creativity, I think creativity is mystical, especially on the flow state level that I was talking about before.
Yeah.
Because it seems like something that we do without doing. You know, creativity for me, or inspiration, seems to be like lightning, like something that you can't control. You can't sit down and be inspired. Like inspiration is something that you find and it carries you to a point and will leave you in the middle of the ocean and you have to row your way back in a direction. And when our arms are tired and the journey is done, we masochistically wait for inspiration to drop us back in the ocean again in order for us to struggle. And I don't know, maybe it's that part. Maybe it's our interesting and weird fascination with struggle, or the fact that we, no matter what direction it seems that we're being carried in, we relish in the lack of control, because in that moment we're actually free of everything. And those are like the few moments that we are really free of the concerns and having to make decisions and do all of the things that like every aspect of our lives tells us that we have to do, right? The flow state is the one time where everything works without effort. Even if that effortlessness has a cost, whether or not that cost is staying home with your guitar by yourself or moving to another town or immersing yourself in whatever art that you're in and denying personal relationships along the way, right? I think that, I don't know what creativity is. I know that that's what it does to me. And for some strange reason, I can't get enough of it. Maybe that's why we all seem to be, as artists, we all seem to be enamored with it.
Man, there's I can't think of a better note to end on than that for this conversation, man. This podcast, I hope in some ways that it makes some people get in touch with their creativity, but everything you just described, it just like hit me, and it was just like, yeah, makes good sense to me. I have nothing else to say. I don't think this has been probably the most exciting conversation I've had in a very long time, and I hope that we can do this again sometime.
Me too.
Jonathan Greene, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me, Tyler.